Hi, everybody. On today's episode of Mad Facts with Pat, we're going to talk about a subject very near and dear to my heart. Well, maybe not my heart, but it's still very near and dear. We're going to talk about a very common form of ritualized genital mutilation, commonly known as male circumcision. Now, the practice of male circumcision actually has been broadly practiced in both the modern and ancient world. It was practiced by the Inca, Maya, Aztec, the Egyptians, some sub-Saharan African groups, as well as some people in the Arabian Peninsula. But the most commonly associated use of circumcision was with the ancient Hebrews. As far as the ancient Near East and Eastern Mediterranean is concerned, the practice of circumcision appears to have originated actually in the Arabian Peninsula sometime around 4000 BCE, before it was transported through cultural diffusion to Egypt and Mesopotamia. And in Mesopotamia, we actually see the practice fairly early at Ur. So before we continue any further, I think it's important for us to discuss briefly what purpose did circumcision, if any, serve in ancient societies. Well, to sum up the three most plausible explanations, one was to act as a rite of transition from pre-adolescence through adolescence. Basically, sometime between the ages of 10 and 14, a young man would be circumcised in order to distinguish him from that child state to adolescent or adulthood. The second most common distinction is one of ethnic identity, that you would form an in-group of circumcised people versus an out-group of uncircumcised people. The third most common use of circumcision was actually to distinguish married from unmarried men. Upon marriage, men would become circumcised, particularly if they had multiple wives. The first marriage would be the one in which they became circumcised to distinguish them from non-married men. Now, important to remember that these weren't necessarily mutually exclusive. They could serve multiple markers. For example, the adolescent transition could also be one of ethnic identity as well. So keep that in mind. For those of you familiar with Genesis 17, Abraham's covenant with God, circumcision marked that entering of covenant and the identity of the ancient Hebrews. Now, for those of us that study archaeology, history, and anthropology, this explanation just doesn't suffice, and we actually look for evidence in both the literary and material record. So where did the practice of circumcision in ancient Palestine originate? And it appears that the largest influence came from Egypt, with possibly some additive reinforcement from Mesopotamia. Now, in ancient Egypt, the practice of circumcision appears to have originated during the pre-dynastic period, and during the Old Kingdom through the Second Intermediate period seems to have been practiced on boys at the onset of puberty. What we have here is the fragment of a relief depicting circumcision from the funerary temple of Djukari, dated to approximately 2600 BCE. That's the Egyptian 5th dynasty. During the New Kingdom period, we actually see a shift in the practice of circumcision, and it appears that the circumcision of infants and younger boys becomes more common. Now, you might be asking me, Pat, why are the ancient Egyptians important? Well, because during the late 16th century BCE, Ahmose I launches a military campaign into what is then Cana, typically referred to as Syria, Palestine today, and the area is conquered, and he defeats the Hyksos and is able to establish both political and military power in the region. The only major upset to that control is when the Hittites are able to wrestle control of Syria from the Egyptians at the Battle of Kadesh against Ramses II. Despite their military alliance with the Hittites, the Israelites are suppressed and subjugated by the Egyptians, as is commemorated on the now famous Merneptah stele. Now, among anthropologists and historians, the general consensus is this is where the ancient Israelites get the practice of circumcision. It was during this period of Egyptian control where they either through force or through emulation and cultural assimilation adopt the practice for themselves. Now, apologists may not like that, but the facts are both the literary and archaeological evidence bear it out. And for that reason, if you look at Joshua 5, there's actually a reference to the fact that the practice of circumcision was reinstituted after the Exodus So you have to ask yourself, what's more likely? That the ancient Hebrews were given a divine mandate by God, or that they were militarily and politically suppressed by a cultural group that already practiced it and had done so for at least 1,000 years before the ancient Israelites themselves adopt the practice? The apologetics just don't hold up. And that's been another mad fact with Pat.